Rome, early 1960s. Audrey Hepburn had just settled into a quiet villa on Via di San Valentino, a picture-perfect retreat where she hoped to raise her son in peace. At first, it seemed like paradise. But soon, strange mosaics appeared on the terrace, arranged in heart shapes. Lines of French poetry carved into tree bark. Someone was leaving messages, signed only as Pro. She brushed it off as poetic admiration, until the security camera told another story. A pale figure in mime makeup drifted through her garden in the middle of the night, captured at exactly 3:07 a.m. He never looked at the lens, as if he were rehearsing for an invisible audience. The authorities discovered a shed nearby, filled with candles, theater flyers, and handwritten love letters to Audrey. But the stalker, known only as Piero, was never caught. After Hepburn's husband hired 2 off-duty paratroopers, the visits stopped. Years later, Audrey admitted she never slept near windows again. She wasn't haunted by what he did, but by how easily he vanished, as if he were part of a dream, or a performance she never agreed to join. In early 1954, Marilyn Monroe was at the height of her fame, but behind the scenes, she was dealing with something far more unsettling than the pressures of stardom. At Fox Studios, head of security Howard Strickling began noticing a series of unusual deliveries. Identical hat boxes, all addressed to Monroe, were arriving regularly. Each one was carefully labeled, "Handle with care." Inside, investigators found dozens of Polaroids taken outside Marilyn's apartment on Doheny Drive. They were time-stamped, 1 per hour, over an entire 24-hour period. Alongside the photos was a velvet sachet filled with strands of blonde hair, later traced to local wig makers. The boxes were signed with a single name: The Collector. Studio investigators linked the return address to a recently fired makeup artist from the River of No Return set. When confronted, he pulled out a straight razor and threatened to take his own life if arrested. Monroe, afraid of how the press might twist the story, asked the studio to handle it privately. No charges were filed, and the man seemed to disappear. But 8 years later, in May of 1962, 3 more packages arrived at her Brentwood home. The contents were disturbingly familiar: new surveillance photos, another lock of hair, and a note that simply said, "Time's up." The LAPD opened a formal case, assigning plainclothes officers to watch her home. Still, no suspect was ever identified. Monroe's housekeeper later testified that the actress began sleeping with the lights on and covering mirrors, convinced someone was watching her from outside. On August 5, 1962, Monroe was found dead from a barbiturate overdose. But one final package had arrived that same morning, and it was never opened. Its contents remain sealed under archival order to this day. The man who called himself the Collector was never named publicly and never charged. Some close to Monroe still wonder whether he ever truly left, or whether he was simply waiting for the next performance to begin. In September 1939, MGM's publicity team was used to odd fan mail. But one particular note caught everyone's attention. It was sent to Clark Gable and read, "You will marry me before year's end," or "Carol Lombard regrets her vows." 3 nights later, Lombard found a single pearl earring on the window ledge of their bedroom. It was an exact match to one she had worn to the Gone with the Wind premiere. Except that pair had never left her jewelry box. Private detectives traced the stationery back to Eloise Carter, an extra recently fired from the set of Idiot's Delight for Erratic Behavior. When police searched her room, they found a wall covered in photographs of Lombard connected by red thread and a drawer full of loose pearls. Before she could be apprehended, Carter vanished, leaving behind only a journal entry: "The king will kneel." The studio kept the matter quiet, assigning guards to the couple's home and hoping the letters would stop. And they did, for a while. In January 1942, just 2 days after Lombard died in a tragic plane crash during a war bond tour, something strange happened. At her public memorial in Indianapolis, a woman dressed in black placed a single pearl earring on top of the condolence book and walked away in silence. Gable picked it up, pocketed it, and according to his biographer, kept both earrings in a locked drawer until his own death. Whether it was Carter who reappeared that day or someone imitating her was never confirmed. LAPD eventually closed the case, citing the primary suspect as presumed deceased. Still, rumors persisted for years. Several people claimed to have seen a woman matching Carter's description wandering outside Gable's ranch in the late 1950s, softly quoting lines from Mutiny on the Bounty. For Gable, the legend served as a quiet reminder: obsession doesn't always end when the story does. By the early 1960s, Grace Kelly had left Hollywood behind and stepped into a very different spotlight, as Princess of Monaco. But royalty didn't protect her from the kind of obsessive attention she thought she'd escaped. In 1962, palace staff began noticing something unusual in the mail. Mixed in with the typical fan letters were Polaroids of her children, Caroline and Albert, playing in the palace's private rose garden. Each photo was annotated with notes like "smile too forced" and "posture correct," all signed simply, "the subject." In response, Monaco's security service installed infrared trip cameras around the property. One of them captured images of a masked figure climbing the cliffside perimeter wall at 2 a.m., setting up a tripod near the nursery window. The intruder managed to escape before guards arrived. Investigators traced the film stock to a student who had abruptly dropped out of a photography program in Paris around the time of Grace Kelly's wedding. His real name was never confirmed. To those who knew him, he was only Luca Rura, the Seeker. A couple of years later, palace guards found a hollowed-out pine tree containing a battery-powered camera pointed directly at the garden lawn. In response, bulletproof glass was installed in the children's rooms, and outdoor access was heavily restricted. After that, the photographs stopped for nearly 2 decades. Then, in 1983, a year after Grace Kelly's fatal car crash, the palace received one final envelope. Inside were new digitized images of the same rose garden, now empty. There was no message, just a single line typed on the back of the last photo: "No subjects worth shooting." The prints were traced to an early French photo lab, but no purchaser was ever identified. To this day, the case remains sealed in the archives of Monaco's security service. And though no one speaks of it officially, visitors to the palace grounds still notice the reinforced fence surrounding the rose garden, a quiet reminder of a lens that once saw too much. In January 1954, Joan Crawford began receiving phone calls at exactly 3 o'clock a.m. Almost every night, the line would ring, she'd pick up and hear nothing but silence, except for faint breathing on the other end. At first, she thought it was a prank, but the calls didn't stop. In fact, they became more personal. The anonymous caller began reciting details of her daily life: where she had lunch, the names of her children's piano instructors, even a private argument she'd had with her maid. None of this information had ever been made public. Crawford's phone company, Pacific Bell, installed a trace system to try and locate the source. What they discovered was unsettling. The calls were coming from a rotating series of payphones scattered across Los Angeles, from Venice Beach to Pasadena, each used only once. Security Chief Jack Benny mapped the callers' movements and realized they were loosely tracking Crawford's daily chauffeur route. Never close enough to be caught, but always one step behind. The LAPD gave the case a name: Stalker X. They advised Crawford to relocate her children for safety. She refused. Instead, she took matters into her own hands. She kept a loaded .38 revolver in her bedroom and began target practice in her rose garden. The final call came on May 9, 1955. It lasted just 12 seconds. The voice on the other end whispered, "I know where you sleep." Then came the click of a phone hook and silence. Years later, while remastering old audio recordings, an engineer noticed something odd buried beneath the voice: a faint freight train whistle. It suggested the calls may have come from Union Station, possibly from one of the open platforms. Investigators tried cross-referencing staff rosters, but found nothing conclusive. Crawford eventually moved to New York. She kept the revolver by her bed for the rest of her life. In interviews, she brushed off the story as crank theatrics, but friends noticed she always answered the phone on speaker after that, keeping her distance from the receiver. As far as the LAPD was concerned, Stalker X vanished. But for Crawford, the silence that followed may have been more disturbing than the calls themselves. In the early 1940s, Bette Davis was one of Warner Brothers' biggest stars, known for her sharp performances and commanding screen presence. But something deeply unsettling began happening behind the scenes. It started with a package. A studio mail clerk flagged it after noticing the envelope reeked of acetone. Inside was a small, violet-tinted perfume vial labeled, "For Your Eyes." The contents were so corrosive that the glass dropper disintegrated overnight. A few weeks later, another delivery arrived in her Warner Brothers mailbox. This time, it was a torn-out newspaper review of Now Voyager, with the word "liar" scrawled across it in crimson lipstick. That was followed by something far more grotesque. A severed pigeon foot, wrapped in a ribbon that came from one of her film costumes. Warner Brothers took the threat seriously. Studio chief Jack Warner hired former detective Johnny Roselli to guard Davis's Coldwater Canyon home. During a sweep of the property, Roselli discovered a brass key hidden under the doormat, an exact copy of a master key used by set designers on Stage 5. It didn't take long to find a suspect. A prop carpenter named Leland Hayes had recently been furloughed for psychiatric evaluation. When investigators reached his Burbank apartment, they found the walls plastered with still photos of Davis, each pierced with sewing needles. But Hayes was gone. Hoping to put distance between herself and the threat, Davis left Los Angeles for a shoot in New York, but the packages followed her there, sent under a false name to her suite at the Warwick Hotel. One contained a clock with its hands soldered at exactly 12:14, the minute her train had left Los Angeles. Then came the warehouse fire. A blaze at a Warner Brothers storage facility claimed the life of a man found wearing Hayes' Union jacket. The coroner was unable to positively identify the body due to the extent of the burns, and no official statement was ever released. Back in Hollywood, Davis quietly made changes. She had steel mail slots installed on set and carried a novelty pepper spray in her handbag. She never spoke about the incident publicly, once joking in an interview that the real drama happens off camera. But among her personal effects, kept until her death, was that severed pigeon foot, sealed inside a studio evidence bag. A disturbing reminder that some fans don't just send flowers. In April 1955, just months before his tragic death, Warner Brothers receptionist Betty Jansen signed for a battered suitcase addressed only with 2 letters, JD. Inside was what appeared to be a personal shrine. There was a toy Porsche, a vial of prairie soil from Kansas, and a taper candle molded in the shape of James Dean's profile. There was no sender name, no return address, just a typed note that read, "For the road ahead." At first it was treated like a bizarre fan tribute, but then came a second package. This one contained a 45 RPM record of cool water, melted and reformed into the initials JD. A third followed shortly after, a lock of blonde hair taken from a rebel without a cause wig, taped to a note that read simply, "You forgot me." Studio investigators traced the parcels to post offices in rural Indiana, but found only rented P.O. boxes. No leads. Dean, always private, joked about the packages with friends, but confided to acting coach Lee Strasberg that they unsettled him. After Dean's fatal car crash on September 30th, 1955, the gifts didn't stop. They just changed addresses. The packages began arriving at his parents' farmhouse in Fairmount, Indiana. Over the next 3 years, they received Polaroids of the crash site taken at dusk, soil samples labeled Mile Marker 466, and an 8mm reel. The reel contained highway footage that had been spliced with images of Dean's childhood photos, an eerie blend of memory and loss. The handwriting on the packages grew increasingly shaky, and by late 1958, they stopped altogether. Years later, in 1979, a local librarian reported seeing an elderly drifter leaving a single flower at Dean's grave every September 30th. He never spoke and always disappeared quietly on a Greyhound bus. Cemetery staff confirmed the ritual continued into the 1990s, though no one ever captured a clear photo. To this day, the identity of the so-called faceless fan remains unknown. Some believe it was a childhood acquaintance. Others think it was a grieving fellow racer. Whatever the truth, many of the artifacts, the suitcase, the candle, the reel, now rest in the James Dean Gallery in Indiana. Strange, haunting relics of a devotion that outlived the man himself. In 1965, during a Vogue photo shoot at the Hotel de Crillon in Paris, Elizabeth Taylor noticed that something important had vanished. A sapphire brooch, a gift from Richard Burton. At first, everyone assumed it had been stolen, but just 2 days later, it reappeared in her suite, neatly wrapped in tissue paper, along with a note that read, "What's yours is mine, and always will be." It was the first sign of what would become a bizarre pattern. A few months later, a Bulgari necklace disappeared from her villa in Rome. It turned up weeks later, sitting in a Tiffany box on her pillow. No signs of forced entry, no cameras captured anything. But the message was clear. Someone had access, and was choosing when to use it. Taylor began referring to the mysterious presence as the Magpie. Lloyd's of London, her insurer, launched an internal investigation and sent a specialist named Cecile Drummond to track the pattern. Over the next 3 years, 17 pieces of jewelry were reported missing and then returned, usually within 90 days and often before Taylor even realized they were gone. The thefts were almost surgical. Safe combinations were copied, set itineraries matched to hotel room break-ins, and wardrobe call sheets were found with pencil markings near valuable items. Drummond narrowed her list of suspects to a small inner circle, including a few bodyguards and a dresser, but polygraph tests proved inconclusive, and no arrests were made. Curiously, when Taylor and Burton divorced in 1968, the thefts stopped. They resumed again, briefly, during their 1975 remarriage. A Cartier ring disappeared from a Geneva bank vault and was returned weeks later by registered mail. This time, the note read, "Reunited, reunited, reunited." After their second and final split in 1976, the silence returned for good. Taylor eventually gave up reporting the incidents to insurance companies. She once quipped at a charity gala in 2002 that the Magpie had excellent taste and even better timing. Some suspected a lovesick staff member. Others whispered that Burton himself might have orchestrated it all, a secret game of romantic theatrics. The brooch that started it all was later auctioned for $5.9 million, still accompanied by the original taunting poem, a jewel boxed inside a mystery that was never solved. In October 1954, actor Montgomery Clift received a peculiar gift at his New York townhouse, a Max Factor compact. But instead of makeup, the powder had been sculpted into a screaming mask that resembled his own face. A note was tucked beneath it. "We look alike, but I'm braver." Days later, another compact arrived. This time, the powder formed a serene smile. That was only the beginning. Soon, Clift's housekeeper started noticing footprints on the roof and cigarette butts near the skylights. Then, one afternoon, Clift opened his wardrobe and found a mannequin. It had been tailored to his exact body measurements and was dressed in a tuxedo he had discarded after filming From Here to Eternity. The porcelain face was unpainted, but faint pencil lines traced the contours of Clift's cheekbones and jaw, as if someone had been trying to replicate him. Private investigator Jack Basso followed the trail to a man named Arthur Bledsoe, a former stand-in who had been dismissed from the Heiress after claiming he could replace Clift with enough practice. When Basso confronted him, Bledsoe didn't deny his obsession, but there was no direct threat, no crime to charge. LAPD declined to intervene. Clift hired 2 ex-Marines for round-the-clock security, but sightings continued. A man in a trench coat was seen lurking outside Clift's building, mimicking the actor's post-accident limp. When approached, he disappeared into Central Park. Then, in 1959, Bledsoe vanished entirely. His rental room was later found filled with sketches, portraits blending Clift's face with his own. And the mannequin? It vanished from storage following Clift's death in 1966. Friends noticed that in his final years, Clift began taping newspaper over mirrors and slept with the hallway lights on. It wasn't out of vanity or superstition. It was fear. The kind born from seeing a version of yourself staring back with intentions you couldn't predict. Biographer Patricia Bosworth would later write that the Mirror Man reflected every insecurity Montgomery Clift carried. He was more than a stalker. He was a living embodiment of Clift's deepest fears, a doppelganger who blurred the line between admiration and identity. In April 1946, Gary Cooper, already a symbol of rugged American masculinity, was living quietly on his 600-acre ranch in Santa Barbara, but something unexpected disrupted that peace. One morning, ranch hands discovered 5 spent .22 caliber casings arranged in a star pattern on the steps of the tack room. Next to them was a handwritten note, "Your silent admirer watches." Then came the photographs. Unmarked envelopes containing long lens shots of Cooper's 9-year-old daughter Maria playing outside. One caption read, "She'll need a father soon." Alarmed, Cooper contacted Sheriff Bill Brown, who deputized 2 of his ranch wranglers and increased surveillance. But the intruder stayed hidden. Cooper began saddling his horse at dawn, scanning the brush and tree lines himself. On May 12th, he found something. A small canvas pup tent concealed among the chaparral. Inside were canned goods, a Winchester Model 67 rifle, and handwritten pages, quotes from Sergeant York, annotated with comments like "true hero" and "he sees clearly." That evening, the person returned to the tent. It was Eliza Thorne, a local high school art teacher whose diary revealed a years-long fixation on Cooper, dating back to his performance in Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. Cooper didn't run. He spoke to her calmly until deputies arrived. She claimed she had only been shooting at rattlesnakes, not the barn, and insisted she sought a creative connection. Thorne was sent to Camarillo State Hospital for observation. She was released early after Cooper declined to testify against her, citing compassion and perhaps a desire to avoid publicity. Afterward, Cooper installed floodlights around the property and hired a retired Texas Ranger for security. But those closest to him said he never truly let his guard down again. Biographer Jeffrey Myers wrote that Cooper kept nightly watch outside his daughter's room for years, a cowboy silently guarding against dangers the spotlight never showed. During World War II, fan mail poured into RKO's offices, especially for Ingred Bergman. But one particular envelope stood out. It was stained with desert dust and smelled faintly of diesel. Inside was a letter from a U.S. Army corporal named Vincent Hayes, claiming that a photo of Bergman had saved his life during a bombing raid at Lala Mine in North Africa. At first, his letters were grateful and emotional. But as time went on, especially after the release of Casablanca in 1942, his tone shifted. Hayes began writing as if he and Bergman had a personal connection. He described elaborate fantasies of rescuing her from Hollywood corruption and taking her on a liberation tour through the desert in a captured staff car. The situation escalated when Bergman began a U.S. Bond tour. One of Hayes' letters included a hand-drawn map of her upcoming stops, complete with arrival times and hotel names. RKO contacted Army counterintelligence, and Hayes was tracked to a stolen military jeep he had taken from Fort Benning. He had been following Bergman's itinerary cross-country. He was arrested in Chicago in July 1944, court-martialed, and sentenced to 18 months at Leavenworth. For a while, that seemed to be the end of it. But in 1965, 2 decades later, Bergman appeared as a guest on Swedish television. Midway through the interview, she glanced toward the audience and froze. In the second row, a man in military uniform sat quietly with his hand resting on a folded jeep cap. Security escorted him out discreetly. Swedish authorities later confirmed that the man had entered the country using Vincent Hayes' discharge papers. He was unarmed and carried only a scrapbook filled with photographs of Bergman, labeled Operation Reunion. He was deported within 48 hours. Bergman never commented publicly on the incident, but from that moment on, she requested that stage lighting at live events be dimmed, not for drama, but so she wouldn't be able to see the faces in the crowd too clearly. Some memories are best kept in shadow. On June 8, 1953, Doris Day's collie, Mr. Binks, vanished from the yard of her Benedict Canyon home. At first, it was assumed the dog had wandered off, but just 2 days later, a package arrived on her doorstep, and it made the situation far more disturbing. Inside were Polaroids of Mr. Binks sitting calmly on what appeared to be a film set. In one image, he was placed next to a clapperboard that read, "Scene 1, our movie." Alongside the photos was a typewritten note with an ultimatum. Day was to star in a screenplay titled The Song in My Heart, or there would be no happy ending. The FBI got involved, and agents teamed up with Universal Studios' longtime animal trainer, Frank Weatherwax. They identified the soundstage in the photographs as a shuttered lot on the Universal backlot. Surveillance teams staked it out but found only discarded film reels and props. A week later, Mr. Binks returned home. He He was shaken but alive, missing part of one ear. The severed piece was delivered in a film canister labeled Take 2. Forensics matched fingerprints to Victor Lacatter, a former animal handler who had been dismissed from a previous production due to misconduct. Agents eventually tracked him to an abandoned prop truck on the backlot, but it was too late. Lacatter had died by unknown causes. No signs of foul play, but no note left behind. Inside the truck was a storyboard of a Technicolor musical starring Doris Day and Mr. Binks. The scenes were mapped out in detail, with one reel titled Finale: The Rescue. Day was devastated, but used the experience as a catalyst for something positive. In 1957, she founded the Doris Day Pet Foundation, an organization dedicated to animal welfare. She never owned another dog, later telling friends, "Love is a leash that tugs both ways." The FBI closed the case, but some in the studio believed Lacatter wasn't acting alone. One handler remembered a second man, never identified, who quietly quit the lot the same week Mr. Binks was rescued. In 1956, actress Jane Wyman, already an Oscar winner and high-profile figure, due in part to her marriage to Ronald Reagan, received a wooden crate at the studio. It was labeled from a company called Anonymous Crafts. Inside was a life-sized doll. But this wasn't just any doll. It was a disturbingly accurate replica of Wyman herself. Same hairstyle, same freckles. Its glass eyes were connected to servo motors, and its mouth was rigged to a radio receiver. The truly chilling part? The doll's mouth only moved when Wyman's own voice hit a specific pitch, usually during heated arguments. When Wyman raised her voice at home, the doll echoed her words back in eerie synchronization. Electrical engineers were brought in, and they traced the signal back to a bungalow in Benedict Canyon. The residence was rented under the generic alias John Smith, but it was already abandoned when LAPD arrived. Inside, they found blueprints of Wyman's house, design plans for a second doll labeled Ronnie, and several diary pages outlining a plan to replace the originals. Among the personal effects was a toolbox containing microcassette loops of Wyman's laughter, played on repeat. Fingerprints matched Martin Greaves, a television prop designer recently dismissed from General Electric Theater for erratic behavior. After the raid, he disappeared from the public eye for months. Eventually, Universal Studios security spotted him loitering near Gate 2. He escaped again, leaving behind only a pair of binoculars and a handmade sign that read, "She listens through me now." A restraining order was issued, and Reagan, already eyeing a future in politics, hired private security with Secret Service-style protocols. The Wyman doll, nicknamed Jane 2.0, was dismantled and quietly buried in Wyman's garden after her 1965 divorce. Years later, fragments of the doll's crate were donated to the Hollywood Heritage Museum, but with one strange condition in the paperwork, that they never be displayed near mirrors. It was a superstitious request, a final nod to the man who tried to script her life using wires, gears, and a voice that wasn't his to control. In 1941, while filming Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion, Joan Fontaine began receiving handwritten letters signed, "Your Better Twin." At first, they seemed like harmless fan messages, observations on her performance, compliments, even predictions that she would soon marry co-star Cary Grant. But the tone changed quickly. The letters became invasive, including exact duplicates of Fontaine's studio contracts, salary figures scratched out and replaced with inflated amounts, as if renegotiated by someone else. Then came a package containing a ring, an exact replica of her wedding band, perfectly sized, engraved with the words, "We share everything." Her fiancé at the time, Laurence Olivier, dismissed it as an elaborate prank, until a bouquet of lilies, his least favorite flower, arrived at their home with a card reading, "For the widow-to-be." Suspicion turned toward the studio. Investigators discovered that a legal typist named Marjorie Lame had accessed Fontaine's confidential files after hours. When confronted, she denied everything but resigned immediately. Still, the letters escalated. Fontaine hired a private investigator, Fred Otash, who tracked Lame to a boarding house in Glendale. What they found inside was disturbing. Her walls were covered with mirrored photographs of herself and Fontaine, matching hairstyles, makeup, even expressions. It wasn't just imitation. It was duplication. Though there was no direct threat, police issued a formal warning. Fontaine and Olivier divorced in 1947, and soon after, one final letter arrived. It read, "You chose loneliness over me." Enclosed was a recent photo of Fontaine walking alone across the RKO lot, time-stamped the previous afternoon. Fontaine kept the replica ring in a velvet pouch for the rest of her life. When asked about it in interviews, she'd occasionally pull it out and say, "It was the strangest love letter I ever received." Layham was never charged, and her whereabouts after the investigation remain unknown. Some believe she faded into obscurity. Others think she continued working quietly in the industry, editing scripts with twin heroines and parallel destinies, always just out of frame. Tallulah Bankhead was no stranger to theatricality, both on and off stage. Known for her bold persona and razor-sharp wit, she often thrived on shock value. But even she was unnerved when her personal space became a stage for someone else's script. In the 1940s, during her Broadway run in The Little Foxes, Bankhead began receiving anonymous phone calls between midnight and 2:00 a.m. What made them different wasn't the timing, but the content. The voice, always male, always calm, recited diary entries she had written just hours earlier. Word for word. At first, she thought it was someone close to her leaking private information. But then, during a routine stage renovation, electricians discovered a dictograph, a covert listening device. Hidden beneath the chaise lounge in her dressing room, wires snaked through a trapdoor and into the building's electrical junction. Payroll records pointed to an electrician hired under the name Edward Corey, who had stopped showing up for work shortly after the calls began. He was never seen again. Not long after, during a matinee performance, Bankhead returned to her dressing room to find something else, a wax mask of her own face, affixed to her vanity mirror. A single stage tear had been painted down one cheek. She screamed, and stagehands rushed in. One man in overalls was seen fleeing into the Times Square crowd, but was never caught. Police traced the wax mask to a novelty shop that had sold only 2 of that specific model. One was purchased by Corey. The buyer of the second was never identified. Weeks later, a parcel arrived addressed to Bankhead. Inside was an unfinished script titled Her Secret Voice. It had been stolen from her locked desk and annotated in the margins, with edits that positioned the story's heroine opposite an anonymous narrator from the shadows. The theater hired armed guards. Phone systems were rewired. Corey's true identity was never confirmed, and no charges were filed. Bankhead kept the wax mask in a cedar drawer at home, occasionally pulling it out at parties to prove the story was real. "I adore a captive audience," she once said, "but one at a time, darling." In her later years, she always requested that house lights be brought up before curtain call. Not for applause, but so she could scan every face in the crowd before blowing her final kiss.